Ethan Calloway stood at the massive window of his penthouse, pretending to admire the glowing skyline of Neo-Seattle. In truth, his attention was fixed on the sleek, purple and white interstellar cleaning shuttle as it docked at the building's skyport. His pulse quickened at the sight. It was Wednesday, Lirien's day. "Home system, activate privacy mode," he commanded, adjusting the collar of his casual button-up. "And dim the windows by 10%. "Privacy mode engaged, Mr. Calloway," the AI responded smoothly. "However, I must note that this is the 9th consecutive Wednesday you've made this request at precisely this time." Ethan shot an unimpressed glance toward the nearest sensor. "I don't recall asking for commentary." "Of course not, sir. Miss Lirien's shuttle has completed docking. She is now in the elevator." Ethan stepped away from the window, feigning casual indifference. Over the past few months, a pattern had developed. He worked from home on Wednesdays under the excuse of availability in case the cleaning service needed anything. But he knew the truth, it was about her. The elevator chimed. His carefully rehearsed nonchalance shattered the moment the doors slid open. Something was wrong. Lirien stood there, but not in her usual pristine uniform. Instead, she wore a form-fitting bodysuit in a deep shade of indigo, accentuating her athletic frame. Her violet skin had darkened, flushed with an intensity he had never seen before. Even more striking, her normally bright teal eyes were glowing, casting faint luminescent shadows across her high cheekbones. Around her neck, a crystalline pendant pulsed softly with ethereal light. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice melodic yet strained. Perhaps I shouldn't have come today." Ethan stepped forward instinctively. "Lirien, are you okay?" She took a half-step back, pressing against the elevator wall. "Yes. No. She faltered, breathing unsteadily. "This was a mistake. I should have called in sick. But I didn't want to disappoint you. I take pride in my work." "Come inside," he said, concern growing. "At least sit down. You look like you're about to collapse." Lirien hesitated before nodding and moving past him into the penthouse. The scent that trailed after her was intoxicating, like cinnamon and something celestial, if starlight had a fragrance. She barely made it halfway to the couch before stumbling. Ethan caught her by the arm, his fingers grazing her warm skin. The moment they touched, a visible shudder ran through her entire body. The pendant at her throat flared brighter. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling away. "Oh, I'm not myself today." "Then talk to me," Ethan urged, keeping his distance now but watching her carefully. "What's going on?" Lirien sank onto the couch, her fiery crimson hair falling forward, partially obscuring her face. "It's complicated and embarrassing. And completely unprofessional." She took a deep, steadying breath. "I'm experiencing my species' mating cycle." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Your mating cycle?" She nodded, still avoiding his gaze. "Every 7 years, adult Val'ari enter a period of heightened biological imperative. Our empathic abilities increase exponentially, and we're drawn to those with whom we share deep emotional bonds." Her fingers traced the glowing crystal at her neck. "This pendant is a family heirloom. During the cycle, its light reveals the depth of our connections." Ethan struggled to process her words. "I don't understand. Why did you come to work?" Finally, she looked up, her glowing teal eyes locking onto his. "Because I couldn't stay away," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Because?" The pendant pulsed. "Because it's you, Ethan." His breath caught. Lirien turned abruptly toward her cleaning supplies, fumbling for a maintenance drone. "I should work. That's why I'm here. I can control this, enough to do my job." Her hands trembled as she activated the drone, but the little machine whirred erratically, its lights pulsing in sync with her pendant. "Lirien, maybe we should talk about this," Ethan suggested, stepping toward her. "There's nothing to discuss," she insisted, though her body instinctively leaned toward him. "I'm your cleaning service provider. This is inappropriate. I shouldn't have said anything." "You're more than just a service provider," Ethan said softly. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I look forward to Wednesdays." The drone in her hand spun faster, its tiny engine whirring anxiously in response to her emotions. "Mr. Calloway, please," she pleaded. "You don't understand. The cycle, it amplifies everything. Every feeling, every attraction. It becomes overwhelming." "Then help me understand," he pressed. Another step closer. The pendant's glow flared. "In my culture, the mating cycle is sacred," she whispered. "Bonds formed during this time are permanent. Irrevocable." She set down the agitated drone, her hands tightening into fists. And cross-species relationships are already complicated. My people barely accept them under normal circumstances, let alone under the influence of the cycle. Ethan absorbed this in silence, watching the way she fought to keep herself composed. Every movement looked deliberate, as though she were resisting an invisible force. You said you've been trying to ignore your feelings for months, he said carefully. So have I. The cleaning supplies clattered to the floor as Lirien spun to face him, her eyes wide. Don't, she warned, but her voice was barely a whisper. Please don't say things like that. You don't know what it does to me in this state. As if to prove her point, every cleaning drone in the room suddenly activated at once, creating a chaos of spinning brushes and humming machinery. The pendant around her neck blazed like a miniature star. I'm not just saying it, Ethan insisted. Every Wednesday I make sure I'm home. I watch for your shuttle. I find reasons to be in whatever room you're cleaning. I notice everything about you. The way you hum while you work. How you arrange my books by color because you know I like it. The way you, stop. Lirien gasped, pressing her hands to her temples. The equipment's frantic movements grew wilder. You don't understand, I can feel everything you're feeling right now. Every emotion. Every desire. It's too much. Ethan took another step forward, close enough now to see the faint silver freckles scattered across her violet skin. Then tell me what you feel. She squeezed her eyes shut. Desire, she whispered. Affection. Curiosity. Concern. Fear. His brow furrowed. Fear of what? She opened her eyes, raw emotions swirling in their glowing depths. Of ruining everything. Of giving in. Of what my people would say if a Val'ari bonded with a human. She hesitated, her breath shaky. Of how much I want this, despite all of that. The cleaning equipment around them suddenly powered down, plunging the room into silence. The only sound left was the rapid beat of their hearts. Lirien, Ethan started. She straightened, forcing herself to speak evenly. Mr. Calloway? Ethan, he corrected gently. Call me Ethan. Lirien exhaled, trembling. Ethan. I should go. Lirien stood frozen, her glowing eyes locked onto Ethan's. The pendant at her throat still pulsed, though the rhythm had slowed as if uncertain. She had said too much. Allowed too much. The cycle was making her reckless. She turned toward the door, every muscle in her body screaming at her to flee before she lost all control. Lirien, wait. His voice was softer now, but it carried weight. A plea. She clenched her fists. I shouldn't be here. I should have stayed home. You didn't? His simple response made her breath hitch. No, she hadn't. She could have called in sick, could have found a dozen reasons to avoid him, but she hadn't. Because despite everything, the warnings, the dangers, the consequences, she had needed to be here. Ethan took a slow step forward, careful, measured, like he was approaching a skittish animal. Talk to me? Lirien squeezed her eyes shut. There's nothing to talk about. You said bonds formed during this time are permanent, he pressed gently. If that's true, wouldn't it be better to face this instead of pretending it isn't happening? You don't understand, she whispered. I can't bond with you. Ethan hesitated. Because I'm human? Yes. No. It's not just that. She opened her eyes, her voice thick with frustration. My people believe that a Val'ari who forms a cycle bond outside our own kind is weakened. That it disrupts the natural order. My family, she stopped, shaking her head. It doesn't matter. It can't happen. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then, what if it already has? Lirien flinched. Don't. His expression softened, but he didn't back down. You said yourself the cycle amplifies emotions, not creates them. That means this was already there. Even before today. Her breath shuddered out. That's exactly why this is dangerous. Ethan reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and gently brushed his fingers against her wrist. A spark jolted through her, and the pendant flared bright, washing the room in shimmering violet light. Lirien gasped, jerking her hand back, but the damage was done. The connection was undeniable. Ethan inhaled sharply. Tell me you don't feel that? I do, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. And that's the problem. Lirien? No, she took another step back, retreating toward the elevator. I shouldn't be here. I can't be here. Running won't change this. It might be the only choice I have. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but she pressed the control panel before he could stop her. The elevator doors slid open, an escape she knew she had to take before she made the biggest mistake of her life. She turned to leave. Lirien? His voice stopped her, one last time. She didn't turn around. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, just know that." Her fingers trembled as she gripped the doorframe, as if the weight of his words was pressing down on her. Then the door slid shut between them, and Lirien ran. Lirien barely remembered the shuttle ride back to her apartment. Her mind was a storm of emotions, her body still vibrating from the aftershocks of Ethan's touch. The pendant at her throat had dimmed, but it still pulsed faintly, a reminder of what had just happened, what she had tried so desperately to prevent. She stumbled through the doorway of her small, minimalist living space and immediately activated the privacy locks. The walls hummed as they sealed, isolating her from the outside world. She needed time to think, to breathe. Collapsing onto the couch, she buried her face in her hands. The cycle was only just beginning, and already it was spiraling out of control. I shouldn't have gone. I should have stayed away. But she hadn't. And now, she wasn't sure how to undo what had been set in motion. A soft chime echoed through the room. A message. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something in her gut told her to check. With a slow exhale, she activated the interface and Ethan's name flashed onto the screen. Her heart pounded as she hesitated, then tapped the message open. "Ethan, I know you're scared. I don't want to make this harder for you. But please don't shut me out. Not after today." Lirien's fingers hovered over the response pad. She had spent months pretending her feelings didn't exist. And now that the truth had forced its way out, she wasn't sure she was strong enough to keep running. She swallowed hard, then typed 2 words. "Lirien, I can't." Her hands shook as she hit send. Seconds later, another message appeared. "Ethan, then tell me what you need." Lirien stared at the words, her heart hammering in her chest. What did she need? Escape. Clarity. A way to break free from the cycle's pull before it consumed her completely. Or maybe she needed something else entirely. Lirien didn't respond to Ethan's message. She couldn't. Instead, she forced herself off the couch and walked to the small basin in her bathroom. Splashing cool water on her face, she avoided looking at herself in the mirror. She didn't want to see the uncertainty in her own eyes. A sharp knock at the door made her freeze. Her heart stuttered. No one ever visited her. Not without warning. She turned, muscles tensed. "Who is it?" Silence. Then, "It's me, Ethan." Lirien's stomach twisted. How had he even found her address? "I'm not letting you shut me out," he continued through the door. "You don't have to talk. You don't have to let me in. But I need you to know I meant everything I said." Lirien's fingers curled into fists. She should tell him to leave. She should ignore him. Instead, she found herself moving toward the door. Slowly, cautiously. She pressed her hand against the panel but didn't open it. Ethan sighed. "I don't know what happens next. I don't know what this means for you. For us. But I know one thing." Lirien swallowed. "What?" "I'm not going anywhere." A shuddering breath left her lips. The pendant pulsed again, resonating with the truth in his words. She squeezed her eyes shut. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. She didn't know how long she stood there, hand pressed to the door, heart warring with her mind. Finally, she exhaled shakily and activated the door's privacy screen, allowing only audio through. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," he answered instantly, his tone steady, grounding. Lirien hesitated before speaking again. "You shouldn't be. You keep saying that." A hint of dry amusement laced his words. "But I'm still here." Her lips twitched despite herself. Typical human stubbornness. "Why did you come?" she asked, needing to understand. "Because you're struggling and I refuse to pretend I don't see it." His voice softened. "Because you don't have to go through this alone." Lirien clenched her fists. "I do have to. You don't understand what's at stake." "Then help me understand," he said gently. "Let me in." For a long moment she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears. Finally, her fingers moved on their own, deactivating the lock. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Ethan stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her carefully. He looked tired, concerned, determined. She crossed her arms, suddenly feeling vulnerable. "I don't know what you want me to say." "Say whatever you need to," he said simply. Lirien exhaled. "I'm terrified." Ethan's gaze softened, but he didn't try to comfort her with empty words. He just nodded, waiting. "This cycle, it isn't just about emotions," she continued, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "It's biological. It's instinct. And once the bond takes hold, it's permanent. I can't afford to get this wrong. You think this is wrong? Ethan asked carefully. I think it's dangerous, she admitted. For both of us. Ethan took a slow step inside, the door sliding shut behind him. I don't see it that way. Lirien let out a bitter laugh. Because you're human. You don't have to face the consequences of this bond. I do. Ethan frowned. And what exactly do you think I'm feeling right now? You think this isn't terrifying for me too? She faltered. I know this is a risk, he went on, voice steady. I know that once this bond takes hold, it's forever. But the way I see it, that's not a reason to run. That's a reason to be sure. Lirien swallowed hard. And are you? Ethan took another step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. I've been sure for a long time, Lirien. Her heart pounded against her ribs, the pendant at her throat pulsing in response to the emotions swirling between them. She searched his face, looking for any trace of hesitation, any sign that he didn't fully understand what he was stepping into. She found none. Lirien inhaled shakily. This isn't just attraction, Ethan. I know. If we do this, if the bond takes hold, you will feel it too. Ethan held her gaze. Then show me. A tremor ran through her. Her instinct screamed at her to resist, to retreat. But another, deeper part of her whispered that she had already lost that battle. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached up and touched his hand. The connection roared to life. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath as a rush of warmth and energy crackled between them. The pendant ignited, bathing them both in violet light. Lirien felt it click into place, the bond weaving itself between their emotions, their very beings. There was no turning back now. Ethan's fingers curled around hers, his grip steady, grounding. Whoa, he breathed. Lirien let out a shaky laugh, her eyes burning. Yeah. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than fear. She felt home. The air in Lirien's apartment seemed charged, like the calm before a storm. Ethan's hand in hers was the only thing grounding her, the only thing tethering her to this reality. The bond that had just sparked between them was undeniable, stronger than anything she had ever felt, anything she had been trained to resist. Her pulse was erratic, her breath shallow as she looked into his eyes. The bond between them shimmered in the air, glowing faintly in sync with the pendant at her throat. Every beat of her heart seemed to echo his. I told you, Ethan whispered, his voice hushed with awe and something deeper. I've been sure for a long time. Lirien's heart thudded painfully against her ribcage. She was aware of every breath he took, every flicker of emotion that passed through him. Fear, curiosity, wonder, they all swirled in a tide that felt far too large for her to control. But it was more than that. There was an overwhelming sense of safety, of belonging, that began to drown out the fear. But she couldn't shake the thoughts that plagued her mind. What now? Her voice was shaky as she pulled her hand away. Ethan, this changes everything. Then let it, he said, his gaze never leaving hers. His tone was firm but tender. Let it change everything. I'm not asking you to go against who you are, but I'm not leaving. Not now. Lirien's thoughts raced, conflicting instincts warring within her. Her entire life, her culture, her people, had been built around control. Everything was about control. The Val'ari mating cycle was supposed to be a sacred, private matter, not something shared with a human. The moment the bond was formed, the consequences would be irreversible. And yet, she had felt it too. That surge of emotion when their hands had met, that silent recognition that they were already bound, whether she was ready for it or not. I didn't want this, she said quietly, stepping back. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to hurt myself. Ethan's expression softened, and he stepped closer again. I don't want you to hurt either. But running from this, running from us, won't stop it. It'll only make things worse. Lirien's breath caught, and for the first time she realized something deep within her. The fear she had been holding onto was not about the bond itself, but about the vulnerability it would demand. To allow someone in, to allow someone to be part of this overwhelming, sacred experience. She didn't know how to let someone in like that. Not like this. Not when the stakes were so high. What happens if we do this, Ethan? Her voice was almost lost in the weight of her own words. What if I'm wrong? What if my people find out? What if they... Then we deal with it together, Ethan interrupted gently. I'm not asking you to face this alone anymore. She turned away from him, her gaze drifting to the window, her mind lost in the tangled web of her thoughts. She wasn't sure she could do this. But she wasn't sure she could not either. The faint pulse of the pendant at her neck reminded her of how deeply the bond had rooted itself. It wasn't just the attraction, the desire. It was something deeper. A pull she couldn't deny even if she wanted to. She closed her eyes, taking a long, slow breath. "I can't keep pretending it's not happening," she murmured. "I've spent months trying to keep my distance, Ethan. Months. And every Wednesday it felt like I was suffocating. But this?" She turned to face him again, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is real. And now I have to decide what that means." Ethan's expression was a mixture of hope and patience. "Then let me help you decide. Whatever it means. Whatever happens next, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The air between them thickened, charged with the raw energy of the bond they had just ignited. It was impossible to ignore it now. Impossible to deny it. Lirien took a step toward him, her heart hammering in her chest, unsure of what came next but knowing deep down that she wasn't as afraid as she had been before. Maybe she had been wrong all along. Maybe the most dangerous thing wasn't the bond itself, but the idea that she had to face it alone. With a soft breath, she spoke the words that had been lodged in her throat for so long. "I don't know what this means for us, Ethan. But I want to try. I want to know. I want to figure this out with you." Ethan's face broke into a soft, relieved smile, and the air between them seemed to settle, the tension easing. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers once again. "I'm here, Lirien. We'll figure it out together. No matter what." The moment their hands touched again, the connection flared brighter, wrapping them both in a gentle but unbreakable bond. Lirien's heart fluttered, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to lean into it. The road ahead would not be easy. The challenges of their cultures, the consequences of the bond, and the risks they both faced weighed heavily on her. But as she looked into Ethan's eyes, saw the sincerity, the unwavering support, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they could face it together. And for the first time, she let herself believe that they might find a way to make it work. The future was uncertain, but Lirien wasn't alone anymore. And that thought was enough to give her the strength she needed to face whatever came next. The first few days after Lirien's visit to his apartment felt like a blur for Ethan. He spent most of his time in the office, working on reports and trying to focus on anything that didn't involve the violet-haired Val'ari woman who had invaded his thoughts. But there was no escaping it. His pulse still raced when he thought of her, the warmth of her touch, the way the pendant had flared to life when they made contact. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way her glowing teal eyes had looked at him, vulnerable, filled with unspoken things, both beautiful and terrifying. Despite his best efforts, his mind kept drifting back to her. Lirien's absence in his life was like an empty space in the room, one he couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. They had shared a bond, something profound that he could no longer ignore. And he knew deep down that neither of them could pretend it wasn't there. Ethan's fingers hovered over the screen of his terminal, staring at the message he had typed but never sent. He knew what he needed to say to her. He just wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it. He deleted the message and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The endless cycle of his thoughts was exhausting. His thoughts were interrupted by a chime from his comm unit. A message flashed on the screen. "Incoming call, Lirien." For a moment, his heart stuttered in his chest. He hesitated, but only for a moment, before accepting the call. Her face appeared on the screen, her expression soft but guarded. "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. He swallowed, his breath catching in his throat. "Lirien, are you okay?" There was a long pause before she finally spoke again. "I needed to hear your voice, to make sure we're still okay." Ethan's heart surged, and he pushed aside the fears and doubts that had been plaguing him. This was her reaching out. This was his chance. "We're more than okay," he said, his voice steady, though his pulse betrayed him. "I told you. I'm not going anywhere." Lirien smiled faintly, her gaze softening, but there was a lingering sadness in her eyes. "You're sure about that? Even after everything? Even after what I told you?" Ethan nodded, resolute. "Yes. Because you're not alone in this, Lirien. I may not understand everything about your cycle or your people, but I do know one thing. What we feel, it's real. And that's enough for me." She looked away for a moment, as though struggling with her emotions. When she met his gaze again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You don't understand how dangerous this is. For both of us." "I know it's scary," Ethan said gently, his voice full of empathy. "But we can face this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Lirien's chest rose and fell with a shaky breath, but she nodded slowly. "I didn't think you'd understand. I didn't think anyone could understand." "I'm starting to," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't need you to explain everything to me, Lirien, but I do need you to trust me. Trust us." The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Then Lirien nodded once, her lips trembling. Okay, I'll trust you. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and a small, relieved smile tugged at his lips. Thank you. That's all I need. She hesitated before speaking again. Ethan, I need you to know that this bond, it's not something I can turn off. Once it's made, it's permanent. It's a decision that affects everything. I'm not afraid of that, he said. But I need you to be sure that this is what you want. Lirien looked down, the weight of his question settling over her like a storm cloud. She was trembling, her fingers curling and uncurling as she stared at the floor. I don't know what I want, she whispered. I don't know if I should want this. Then let me help you figure it out, Ethan said, his voice soft and steady. One step at a time. I'm not asking you to make a decision today or tomorrow, but we need to talk. We need to be open with each other. Her head shot up, her glowing eyes locking onto his. You're willing to wait? Of course, he said, his gaze unwavering. I've waited for you this long. I can wait for as long as it takes. You don't have to face this alone. The silence that followed was different this time. Lighter, warmer. Something between them had shifted, even if it was small. Lirien finally nodded, her lips curving into the smallest smile. Thank you. Ethan smiled back. We'll figure this out. Together. With that, the call ended and the screen went dark, leaving Ethan sitting in his chair, staring at the empty screen. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. There was still uncertainty ahead, but for now they were on the same page. And that was a start. Lirien sat back in her chair, the soft hum of her apartment filling the space around her. She had called Ethan and she had opened up. That was a step, a difficult one, but a step nonetheless. Her heart was still racing from their conversation, her mind tangled in a web of confusion and fear. But there was something else too, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility. The bond, despite all its weight and the risks it carried, felt undeniable. The connection between her and Ethan was too strong, too real to ignore. And though the idea of facing the consequences terrified her, part of her was starting to accept that maybe, just maybe, this was a risk worth taking. She glanced down at the pendant still resting against her chest. It pulsed faintly in time with her heartbeat, a silent reminder of the path she had begun walking. It was both a promise and a warning. Lirien stood and walked to the window, staring out at the neon skyline of Neo-Seattle. The city stretched out before her, vast and full of possibility, but her future felt smaller, confined by the weight of her choices. And yet, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. Maybe they didn't have all the answers yet, but they had each other. And for now, that was enough. Ethan stood at his window, staring out at the same skyline, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions, hope, and resolve. The path ahead was still unclear. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to back down. He had promised Lirien he would be there for her. And no matter what the future held, he would keep that promise. The cycle had only just begun. But Ethan knew one thing for sure. He was ready for whatever came next.